In the summer of 1942, many British commandos believed they were being sent to die. The plan sounded reckless, a direct assault on a heavily defended French port, in broad daylight, against prepared German positions. Even among seasoned soldiers, the Dieppe Raid was whispered about with disbelief. Some called it bold, others quietly called it madness. What none of them could know, standing on the decks of landing craft rolling across the English Channel, was that this failed raid would quietly become one of the most important lessons of the Second World War, a lesson written in blood, a lesson that would ultimately make D-Day possible. The need to strike back. By 1942, Britain was desperate for momentum. France had fallen, the Soviet Union was bleeding in the East, the United States had only recently entered the war. There was immense political pressure to prove that the Western Allies could strike occupied Europe, not someday, but now. The solution proposed was a raid, not an invasion, a large-scale amphibious assault designed to test German defenses, gather intelligence, and demonstrate resolve. The target was the French port of Dieppe. It seemed logical on paper. Ports were thought to be essential for any future invasion. If one could be seized quickly, Allied forces could pour men and supplies directly onto the continent. But among the commandos, doubts spread fast. Ports were obvious targets. They were fortified, covered by artillery, watched constantly. Yet the plan moved forward. The crazy plan. The Dieppe Raid called for nearly 6,000 troops, most of them Canadian infantry, supported by British commandos and a small number of tanks. The assumptions behind the plan were dangerously optimistic. German defenses were believed to be light. Air and naval bombardment was expected to neutralize resistance. Tanks landing directly onto the beach would provide immediate firepower. Commandos who studied the maps noticed problems immediately. The beach was narrow. The surrounding cliffs dominated the shoreline. There was almost no room to maneuver. And worst of all, Dieppe was a port town, meaning the Germans had every reason to defend it heavily. Some officers openly questioned the plan. They were ignored. Dawn at Dieppe. In the early hours of August 19, 1942, Allied landing craft approached the French coast. Almost immediately, things went wrong. German patrols spotted elements of the force early. The element of surprise vanished before the first boots hit the sand. As the sun rose, machine guns opened fire from cliffs, bunkers, and buildings overlooking the beach. Men were cut down the moment the ramps dropped. The beach itself became a killing ground. Tanks that couldn't move. One of the raid's key ideas was the use of tanks to support infantry landings. But when the tanks rolled off their landing craft, reality intervened. The beach was covered in loose pebbles, not firm sand. Tracks spun uselessly. Engines strained, vehicles bogged down almost instantly. Many tanks never made it off the beach at all. Others advanced only a few meters before becoming immobile targets. German anti-tank guns methodically destroyed them. The idea that armor could simply roll ashore and fight was proven disastrously false. Fire from everywhere. German defenses had been underestimated in every way. Concrete bunkers overlooked the beach from elevated positions. Interlocking machine gun fire swept the shoreline. Artillery zeroed in on landing zones with terrifying.
Naval gunfire support was too light and too brief. Air support failed to suppress hardened defenses. The Allies discovered a brutal truth. You cannot fight your way off a beach against prepared defenses without overwhelming firepower and specialized equipment. At Dieppe, they had neither. A raid turns into a slaughter. Within hours, the raid collapsed. Units were pinned down, isolated, or destroyed. Communications broke down almost immediately. Evacuation became as deadly as the landing. Landing craft attempting to extract survivors were hit again and again. By the end of the day, over 1,000 Allied troops were killed. Nearly 2,000 were captured. The majority of Canadian forces never left the beach. It was one of the most costly single-day defeats suffered by the Western Allies during the war. And on the surface, it appeared to have achieved nothing. Why Dieppe mattered. But Dieppe was not ignored. It was dissected. Every failure was analyzed in painful detail, and from those failures emerged lessons that would rewrite amphibious warfare. The first and most important realization was this: ports could not be taken by direct assault. They were too heavily defended, too predictable, too deadly. Future invasions would land on open beaches, not harbors. naval artillery, strategic bombers, tactical airstrikes. The goal was no longer surprise, it was domination. The enemy would be overwhelmed before soldiers ever touched the sand. Intelligence and reconnaissance. Dieppe also taught the Allies the importance of knowing the beach itself. Sand composition, beach gradients, tidal patterns, obstacle placement. Before Normandy, Allied planners secretly collected sand samples from French beaches. They mapped defenses in obsessive detail. Nothing was left to assumption, because Dieppe had proven assumptions were deadly. Normandy, the lesson applied. 2 years later, on June 6, 1944, Allied forces returned to France. This time, everything was different. They did not aim for ports. They landed across 5 open beaches. They arrived behind the heaviest bombardment in history. Specialized armor rolled ashore. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Commandos neutralized coastal batteries. Normandy was still brutal, but it was possible because Dieppe had shown what failure looked like. From failure to foundation. The Dieppe Raid is often remembered as a disaster, and it was, but it was also a necessary one. It revealed truths that peacetime planning never could. It proved that courage alone cannot overcome flawed doctrine, that amphibious warfare demands preparation, specialization, and overwhelming force. The commandos who mocked the plan had been right. It was crazy, but from that madness came clarity. The legacy of Dieppe. Modern amphibious warfare, from Normandy to modern joint operations, still carries Dieppe's DNA. Every landing craft, every beach-clearing vehicle, every hour of pre-landing bombardment, all trace their origins back to that bloody shoreline in 1942. Dieppe failed so that Normandy could succeed. And in war, that may be the most meaningful legacy of all. For the Canadians who fought at Dieppe, the lesson came at a terrible price. Entire units were shattered in hours. Veteran soldiers returned with memories they would carry for life. Families were left with questions that had no comforting answers. For years, Dieppe was spoken of quietly, sometimes defensively, sometimes with anger. But within Allied planning rooms, it was never dismissed. Every casualty report became a data point. Every failure became a requirement. What Dieppe removed forever was illusion, ending the myth of the simple landing. Before Dieppe, amphibious warfare was still shaped by First World War thinking. Landings were assumed to be temporary chaos followed by normal combat. Infantry would land, tanks would support them, command would reassert itself. Dieppe proved that this belief was outdated. Modern coastal defenses were too lethal. Machine guns, concrete, artillery, and overlapping fields of fire turned beaches into traps. From that moment on, amphibious landings were no longer seen as an extension of land warfare. They became their own science. Engineering the beachhead. In the months and years after Dieppe, Allied planners reimagined the beach itself as a battlefield to be engineered. Beaches were no longer just landing zones, they were obstacles to be conquered. Engineers were trained to land in the first waves. Obstacle clearing teams practiced under live fire. Timetables were calculated down to the minute. Nothing was left to chance. Even the tide mattered, because at Dieppe, chance had killed thousands. The silent influence on D-Day commanders. Many of the officers who planned Normandy had studied Dieppe personally. Some had been there. They remembered the sound of machine guns firing straight down the beach. They remembered tanks stuck helplessly in stones. They remembered how quickly confidence collapsed. Those memories shaped every decision in 1944. When commanders argued for heavier bombardment, Dieppe was cited. When engineers demanded specialized vehicles, Dieppe justified the expense. When planners rejected capturing a port on day one, Dieppe ended the debate. It was the ghost in every meeting room. Victory built on failure. Normandy succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was informed. The Allies still suffered heavy casualties. Men still died on the sand. Some units were pinned down for hours, but the system held. Supplies flowed. Armor advanced. Command survived the chaos. And once a foothold was secured, German defenses, already shaken by overwhelming firepower, could not recover. What Dieppe had failed to do by force, Normandy achieved through preparation. A lesson that still endures. Even today, military planners study Dieppe, not as an example of bravery, but as a warning. It reminds commanders that technology, doctrine, and planning must evolve together, that underestimating defenses is fatal, that innovation is often born not from success, but from disaster. Dieppe stands as proof that losing the right battle can win the war. Final reflection. The British commandos who mocked the raid were not wrong. The plan was crazy. But history is shaped not only by victories, it is shaped by the moments when failure forces change. On the beaches of Dieppe, amphibious warfare was broken apart and rebuilt. 2 years later, on the shores of Normandy, that rebuilt doctrine would help liberate Western Europe. And that is why Dieppe, despite everything, mattered.